Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining New York City Bird Alliance for our winter lecture series. My name is Jessica Wilson, and I'm New York City Bird Alliance's Executive Director. You're tuning in for the fourth installment of this lecture series, which runs November to March. This year, our series is entitled Spread Your Wings. A special thanks to Claude and Lucienne Bloch for their ongoing support for this series. Before we get started tonight, a few quick housekeeping notes. As you probably noticed, this lecture is being recorded, and the recording will be posted later this week on our website for anyone to view. But except for me and the speaker, your cameras and mics are turned off, so don't worry, you won't be in the recording. We've enabled closed captioning for this Zoom and in the recording, should you need it. Tonight, we're going to hear from author Chris Cooper. He and I will then have a brief conversation about his book, and we'll have some time for questions at the end from the audience. Throughout the evening, you can type your questions directly into the Q&A feature in Zoom, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the talk, you can also feel free to use the Zoom chat function for general comments, including the great comments about where everybody is, where everyone's joining from. And throughout the evening, we're going to be using that chat function to post links about what we talk about. For those of you who are new to New York City Bird Alliance, let me tell you a bit more about our organization and how you can get involved. New York City Bird Alliance, formerly called New York City Audubon Society, is a conservation nonprofit that protects wild birds and their habitat across the city. We work to make New York City a more bird-friendly place through conservation science, advocacy, and engagement. We have science research projects, including bird surveys and monitoring efforts across the city. And our volunteers are vital to that work. You can join us as a community science volunteer to help us collect data on bird populations and habitat and conservation threats. There's a link going into the chat right now about how you can volunteer. The data that our scientists and volunteers collect then informs our advocacy efforts to protect birds. We're currently focused on making the city's buildings safer to reduce bird collisions, something we might hear a bit about tonight. And we need your help for those advocacy efforts. You can follow the link in the chat for more opportunities to advocate for birds. You can also get involved by just enjoying birds. We know that New Yorkers' connections with birds often start with our engagement efforts. Throughout the year, New York City Bird Alliance offers hundreds of bird outings, classes, workshops, and festivals. And we'd love to see you at one of them. So follow the link in the chat to our calendar of events. But now, on to tonight's event. During our lecture series this winter, we've had the pleasure of hosting birders, authors, and conservation scientists who have discussed the wonder of birds, both around the world and throughout time. Tonight, we return home to New York City to learn about the city's owls with writer and New York City Bird Alliance board member Christian Cooper. Chris is a writer, editor, and expert birder who can often be spotted in Central Park. Born in Manhattan and raised on Long Island, Chris's passion for birds took flight at an early age, leading him to serve as a youth board member of the South Shore Audubon Society and then president of Harvard's Ornithological Club during his undergraduate studies. Chris is the Emmy Award-winning host of the National Geographic TV series Extraordinary Birder and the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Better Living Through Birding. In addition to serving on the board of New York City Bird Alliance, Chris is also a board member of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Somehow, Chris also found time to write a children's book. His latest book, due out in just a few weeks, which is called The Urban Owls: How Flaco and Friends Made the City Their Home. We're delighted to have Chris join us tonight to talk about this book and the city's owls. Thank you, Chris. Take it away.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me. Thank you, Jessica, for that very kind introduction. I have to start before I say anything else about the urban owls by giving a hat tip to Kristen Adam, the artist, who did a magnificent job of giving these owls a little bit of sort of almost animated personality and yet still keeping true to the field marks for the most part of these birds, so that they are identifiable as the species that they are. And that's a great trick that she pulled off. And also, I think that's sort of the trick of the whole book is to incorporate, facts about owls and the science of owls while still making it accessible to children. And also incorporating some other things into the book subtly and hopefully in a way that is, again, accessible and meaningful to children. So for those of you who are wondering, the book is for ages 4 to 8 years old. So it's for younger kids. And the pictures are key, which is why Kristen Adam deserves that huge hat tip at the beginning. So let's take a look at some of that gorgeous artwork. Yeah, hold on. I'm technologically impaired, but hopefully not so much that I can't make this work the way it's supposed to. Let's see, I'm sharing my screen and it is refused. Ah, there we go. Ha ha. So as you can see, we start the urban owls by talking about Flaco. And Flaco is really interesting in a lot of ways. He captured the heart of New York City and captured a lot of attention from people who normally wouldn't pay a lot of attention to the city's birds. And that's a good thing from our perspective as New York City Bird Alliance and people who love birds. Because if we can get people interested, then we can pull them into our world. So Flaco was really great at fostering that interest and pulling people into our world. But there's a couple of things about Flaco that one has to keep in mind. Number one, he's not a wild owl. Number two, he's not a native owl. And number three, his story begins with criminality, since he was someone cut his cage, his enclosure open at the Central Park Zoo, which is where we all sort of pick up his story, and then ends in death. And that's not really great for a children's book. So there are a couple of things that we kind of glide over in making this accessible as a children's book, and that is those are some of the things we had to sort of dance around a bit. But one thing I was really adamant about was that I didn't just want to talk about Flaco. And we do talk about how he got loose in a city, having been a captive owl his whole life. I mean, he was raised in captivity. He lived in captivity in the Central Park Zoo, and suddenly he got loose, and everyone thought, oh, that's it for Flaco. He's not going to make it. The city's going to be too much for him. And then it actually turns out, oh, he did fine. He actually, the owl instincts kicked in, and he was able to catch his own food and survive. And that's, I think, part of what made him so endearing to the rest of the city. But I didn't just want to talk about Flaco. It was really important to me to talk about the wild owls that we have living amongst us. And there's been several celebrity owls that have come into Manhattan, come into the city. And probably the most notable of those is Barry the barred owl. And she became as much of a celebrity as Flaco did almost. And I think in particular because she had a regular roost that she would return to, whereas Flaco could show up almost anywhere in the city. Barry was usually found in one particular roost in the Ramble, and it almost became a shrine. And when she died, oh my goodness, the outpouring of grief and the stuff that people left for her was all in that spot where she was so often found. So there's been a bunch of wild owls that have come through the city, and they can tell us a lot too about our environment and also capture the imagination of the public, much as Flaco did. So it was really important for me to talk about them, and also with each owl that I talk about, I try to talk about it in the context of, with each one, I try to bring in at least one element of owl science, for lack of a better term. So for example, and I forget which owl I attached each fact to, because really they're facts about all owls. But as you can see here, the fact that I chose to talk about with Flaco is the fact that owls have incredible eyesight. If you've ever wondered why an owl has extra neck bones so that it can swivel its head almost all the way around. It's more like 270 degrees, but almost 360 degrees. And the reason why the owl has all those neck bones to do that is because their eyes are so huge and occupy so much room in their heads and their eye sockets that there's no room for eye muscles around the eyes. So that where we can do this, notice how I'm holding my head still, and I can look up, look down, look sideways. That's because we have muscles that move our eyeballs. Birds don't have that because they have so much, because their eyeballs are so big to give them such great visual acuity, and in particular with owls. So that's the fact I kind of zeroed in on here, is that I think the statement or the factoid that we didn't put it in here for the kids, we might have put it in at the end, is that if you lit a candle at the end of a football field, a great horned owl would be able to hunt successfully by the light of that single candle at the opposite end of the football field. That's how incredible their visual acuity is, and their night vision, for lack of a better term, is. So we try to put a little fact like that in with each owl about the fact that there are special feathers along the leading edge of owls' wings that break up the flow of air so that they can fly on silent wing beats. The swiveling of the head because of the neck bones, we put that in when we talked about Rocky, the saw-whet owl that hitched a ride on the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree. So, we're always trying to put those facts in and keep them in a way that's super accessible for kids, so they don't feel like, I'm getting a science lesson. No, that's not the point. But, you will find out a thing or two about owls. The other thing I tried to do with each owl and with the entire book is I really thought it was important to find some parallels or observations that connect our human lives with some aspects of these owls' lives. And it turns out that wasn't hard at all. And it starts with Flaco, when I realized, okay, well, one of the reasons why Flaco captured the imagination of New Yorkers is because here was a bird who really didn't belong in New York City, but he's doing just fine and making the city home for himself. At least he was doing fine for a while. And so I think that resonated with so many people. When so many people come from someplace besides New York and they land in the city, and it's a place that's very different from almost any place else, and yet people find a way to thrive here. And so that's, I think, one of the great appeals of Flaco. So I wanted to draw those parallels. When I talked about how Flaco hunted at night, I said at one point, oh yeah, he works the night shift like a lot of people do. And I imagine a lot of kids reading this book, their parents or one parent or both, or a guardian may actually, or a relative may actually work the night shift. They may be a nurse or working overnight. And so that allows, hopefully, the kids to relate their human experience with some of the owl's experience. And then also the fact, again, going back to Flaco, and the fact that he is a Eurasian eagle owl. His name alone tells you that he is not from North America. And yet he ends up here, and that's true of so many people in New York City. Their families come from someplace else, but they end up in New York City and they find a way to make it home. So I wanted to draw those parallels and observations wherever I could. Here, it was about Geraldine the great horned owl, and her foot, one of her 2 feet, was messed up. And yet she still hunted and did just fine with her hunting. So that's, I think, an important message for kids to get, even if it's subconsciously, that, you know what, you can be different. You can be physically differently abled than another person and still function just fine in the world and have plenty to offer. So, hopefully those messages are layered into the book. And again, beautifully illustrated by Kristen Adam. And then finally, at the end, we talk about how all these owls need our help. They need us to look out for them if they are going to thrive in our cities. And again, because it's a children's book, we didn't want to go too hard on the negatives, on the threats that these owls face. But, and especially in the back matter, we did talk about some of the things you can do to help protect owls. And of course, that's what New York City Bird Alliance is all about, is protecting our wild birds and making sure that they have a way to thrive in the city just as much as we do. And in fact, when they thrive, usually that means that we get a better chance to thrive too. So that's one message that I wanted to end with, which is that, these owls are amongst us. They are, as I like to say, ambassadors from another world, because they live in a nighttime world that we rarely get full access to, rarely get to see. And yet we're all familiar with the fact that owls exist, but we don't get to see them that often. And when we do, it's like this visitor from another world is staring back at us, and it's such an amazing, thrilling experience. So hopefully this will focus the kids on that amazing experience that awaits them of finding owls in their own area, and how we can make sure that those owls have a fighting chance at doing really well. And when we do that, we thrive too. So that's kind of the arc of the book. Trying to fold those messages in with not a lot of words, but a lot of pictures. And yet, kind of tell a maybe somewhat enchanting and enchanted way, the story of all these owls that have come through New York City, and how they kind of changed the way we look at the city. So yeah, that's the idea. The book comes out February 18th, so really soon. And it's pretty much available everywhere. And it's my first time doing a children's book, which was interesting, but not as different for me as one might think, because for those of you who don't know, I have a background way back in comic books, in producing comic books. So there, again, it's a visual medium as well as words. And it's a collaborative medium. So it's a collaborative process, not just me, blah, blah, blahing, but my blah, blah accompanying images, and that the two should reinforce each other. So that's kind of what I brought to the experience and learned from the experience is again, that collaborative process that I had done before, but this time a little bit differently in doing a children's book. So hopefully people enjoy it. Hopefully people will like it. And I guess that's pretty much the story of the book. I don't know if there's more for me to spout about, but there's plenty of questions I can answer. And I know, Jessica, you had questions you wanted to ask me, so I am 1,000% open to it.
I sure do have questions, Chris, and thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear about your process of writing the book and to see those absolutely gorgeous illustrations, and to learn all those really cool owl tidbits, some of which were new to me too. I'm sure our audience is going to have a lot of questions, but I can get the conversation started. But a reminder for our audience, if you do have questions, please drop them into the Q&A function in your Zoom screen. Again, the Q&A is at the bottom of your screen. Chris and I are going to talk for a few minutes now, and then we'll get to audience questions in a little bit. But let's start the conversation. I'd love to hear a little bit more about why you decided to write a children's book. Children's books are a little bit different from comic books. The audience is different. What inspired you to focus this one for kids?
It's really important to get them while they're young. And I say that as somebody who was gotten while he was young. I started birding when I was 9 or 10 years old. And this is aiming even younger than that, which I think is really important. Because, the sooner we get kids appreciating our birds, the more likely it's going to become a lifelong habit and second nature, and something that they value and cherish throughout their lives, that will enrich their lives. I think probably most people watching this are birders who have that experience of that great richness in their life brought to them by birds. I was just telling Jessica right before we went live that, I'm in Southern California right now, where I'm not going to torture any of you New Yorkers with telling you the temperature, but I'll just say I was outside, sitting outside in shorts and a t-shirt. And for the second time in my life, a Costus hummingbird female started flying up my leg And this time, then she didn't stop my leg. She flew up my arm. And then finally, she was flying along the side of my head, checking me out with her bill. And my theory is that it's the start of nesting season. And, you know, all this hair looks like good nesting material to her. So she was like unafraid and checking it out. And having that kind of experience, having the world of wild birds come to you of its own accord and being immersed in that world and seeing how they live, it enriches your life. It takes away your woes. It gives you a new perspective. So I think the earlier we can get kids started having that kind of experience, the better. And the better it's going to be for our world, because they'll be out there eventually fighting to save these things that they love.
It's an incredible moment with that hummingbird. We don't often get so close to hummingbirds here in New York City, but we get close to a lot of other really amazing wild birds. I noticed, because it's a children's book, you don't touch that much on the threats that these owls face. That was a real concern while Flaco was alive. And of course, it's a concern that, as you noted, New York City Bird Alliance fights to protect against every day the threats that wild birds face, between rodenticide poisoning and collisions with buildings. Can you talk a bit about how awareness of those threats have changed as birding has become more popular and birds like Flaco have entered the scene?
Sure. One obvious example, CBS Sunday Morning, a hugely popular show with a huge nationwide audience, did a story about Flaco and how he died from a collision, and used that as a jumping off point to talk about collisions in general. That's incredible. That something we've been talking about and fighting for so long became national news again, thanks to Flaco. He was the springboard to have this discussion on a national level. So yeah, the Flaco and the other owls, you know, when Barry died, people were like, wow, rodenticide is really a problem. It focused people's attention. You know, they could put a name to it. In fact, they have literally put a name to it, in that both the city and I think the proposed state legislation are called Flaco's Law. And typical of politicians, at least the state version, the Flaco stands for something. I'm trying to remember now. It's something like feathered life needs help too, or something like that, but something that spells Flaco. And I'm like, they always do that. I don't know. They should probably be writing like headlines or captions for the New York Post, because they're so clever with coming up with these acronyms. But literally, Flaco's name is now on legislation that will hopefully help save raptors. I think even more than collisions, from the point of view of raptors, the problem was rodenticide. And I know the use of rodenticide is extremely limited, if at all, in the city's parks. But the problem is, you know, our raptors don't just hunt in the parks. So if they go outside the parks, they are at risk of rodenticide. And it seems to be in all of them. Whenever there's a whenever they find it, they get a dead bird and they do an autopsy on it afterwards, they always find in the raptors some level of rat poison in their system that compromises their ability to survive. And I will speak for myself. I cherish the red-tailed hawks that nest in my neighborhood in the East Village in Tompkins Square Park. They are thrilling, and nothing is more thrilling than roughly about like late June, July, when the fledglings are flopping around Tompkins Square Park like gangly teenagers, trying to figure out, what do I do with these wing things? How do I hunt some food? And they've grown up around people their whole lives, so they're fearless, and they're like right there in your face. Again, encounters with wild creatures, up close and personal. And everybody in the park looks forward to it. And what also amazes me is how East Villagers are so protective of these birds. Like, you don't mess with these red-tailed hawks, you don't mess with their fledglings, because they're our birds and we want to see them thrive. But, rodenticide is a problem for them. And, the East Village, in my opinion, is the rat capital of certainly of Manhattan, if not all of New York City. And, I'm tripping over them when I go to the gym before dawn in the morning, literally tripping over them. So, I get it. We have a rat problem, but we've got to find a way to deal with it besides rodenticide if we want to continue to have these wonderful up close and personal experiences with raptors like those fledglings in Tompkins Square Park every year. So it's up to us. It's up to us, and that's one thing we put at the end of the book. We didn't, again, we felt like we had to keep it kid friendly, especially in the meat of the book. But at the end, we definitely put in some things about how, hey, look, these are some of the threats that owls face, and we can help by trying to eliminate some of these threats.
These owls like Flaco and like Barry certainly brought to light the dangers of rodenticide, but they also brought a lot of attention to owls. And there was, as we all saw, an outpouring of grief when Flaco died exactly a year ago. And it was argued at the time that we shouldn't be anthropomorphizing a bird, especially those that aren't native to New York. We shouldn't be glorifying them. How do you feel about that? And how do you feel about giving birds personalities in a book like this?
I'm of two minds with that. And in particular with Flaco, I had real mixed feelings for a couple of reasons. I was captured like everybody else in New York, but at how he survived against the odds, at least initially. But I also recognized that he was potentially a problem for our native great horned owls and for our peregrine falcons. Our city having the highest concentration of nesting peregrine falcons of just about anywhere, any major city. And a great horned owl will make a meal of a great horned owl. A great horned owl will, but a Eurasian eagle owl, which is even bigger, will make a meal of a peregrine if they can catch it. So I was worried about that. There was just a little bit of a birder's annoyance of walking through the park with your binoculars, and some civilian, as I like to call them, someone who is not a birder and steeped in our world, would see you with binoculars and immediately rush up and say, "Oh, were you looking for Flaco?" And I'm like, "No, I'm not looking for Flaco." So it kind of puts an odd spotlight on our birds when a bird becomes a celebrity. The one that really drove me crazy was the mandarin duck. I'm like, you realize you can order about 10 of them for $9.95 online, but so many people were just like gaga over the mandarin duck, and they would go and they would look at it, and there was a wood duck, the same genus as a mandarin duck, so closely related, gorgeous in its own right and native, and it's right there and nobody's looking at it. And I'm like, look at the wood duck. The wood duck is gorgeous too. So, it can be a little bit of a problem. That said, Flaco just put such a good spotlight on birds and birding in general, and also as I talked about, gave us leverage for some of this legislation, that it's hard to complain about Flaco. So there's that. As far as anthropomorphization in general, I'm of two minds on that too. And I am generally against anthropomorphization. I mean, I think it's a mistake to presume that the lives of birds are going to have the same content and context as our lives. One of the ways I find it comes up frequently is some people who are, again, civilians, not birders like us, will say, "Oh, where do birds go at night? Do they go into the bird houses?" And I'm like, Wow, that's some real Homo sapiens bias there. That you think we, as a cave dwelling species, we need something over our heads, but that's because we're a cave dwelling species. They're perfectly fine on a branch. And they're like, well, what about birdhouses? I'm like, what about them? They're cribs. For almost all birds, a nest is really just a crib for raising the young. It is not a house like ours that's a home. And so that's where anthropomorphization can really lead you to some wrong conclusions. That said, I think it's also a mistake to assume that there's nothing in common between our lives and birds' lives. That's a mistake in the other direction because we're animals too. They're animals, we're animals. We live on the same planet. There's almost certainly some common elements to our experience, to how we view the world, to how we experience the world, simply by the fact that we are animals too. So, to assume that birds don't feel grief, to assume that birds don't experience anger, I think that's a mistake too. So it's a real hard balance to strike, where when are you overcorrecting in one direction or the other? And there's really no good way to know. All
And
you
it's
can do is make your best guess.
And it's an interesting note that we're animals and we have things in common with these birds also. And your book makes some references to that, as you noticed, as you had noted, the book makes references to marginalized groups throughout the city, like Flaco, who found a home in the city. He wasn't originally from here, but he found a home. And Geraldine, the great horned owl, who's living with a disability. What inspired you to include those references and those nods to adversity, resilience, and inclusivity?
Well, I want to back up just a little bit to say that most of that is not anthropomorphization, or at least not what I would consider, excuse me, anthropomorphization, in that I may be observing a similarity in their lives and our lives, but I'm not saying they think the same way we do, or they do the same things we do. There's a parallel that can be observed, but I don't want us to fall into the trap of thinking, that it's exactly the same thing and they're thinking exactly the same way. That said, why did I feel like I needed to do that? It's because I wanted a little bit more depth to what we were talking about. And plus, my whole life I've been an activist. I'm an unabashed social justice warrior. And I say that with humor and pride. Unapologetically and unironically. I think the alternative these days to being a social justice warrior is to be what we're seeing a lot of coming out of Washington these days, which is to be a barely disguised Nazi, zig heiling and then saying, that's not really what I was doing. I don't want to be that. I want to be something else. I want to be a person who throws open the doors to everybody, who makes sure everybody knows they have a place. And it's not hard to do. It's just a matter of being human and being kind. And I think it's important to instill those values into kids, as early as possible. And, not in any heavy-handed way, hopefully, but just in a way where they can go, oh yeah, that's what happened to this owl, and that's kind of what happens to my friend Robert, or whatever. So I find that very important. And I will even take this opportunity in my defense of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, are we still allowed to say that word? That for all the huffing and puffing against DEI that we are hearing these days and the mischaracterization of what it's about, you know what? Note the huffing and puffing, let them huff and puff. Guess what? New York City Bird Alliance, our building, our foundation is strong enough to withstand all the huffing and puffing coming out of Washington, and we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that the doors are open and inclusive to everybody. So, sorry, I just had to get that in.
I appreciate that from someone who's also always on a soapbox. It's great to share that message and wholeheartedly agree that our work to include everybody in enjoying birds and learning about them is so important because everybody needs to protect birds from all the threats that we've talked about already. And we need everybody.
We need all hands on deck.
We sure do. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move from the owls and the threats to the pictures in the book, which are just gorgeous. And in fact, we had a lot of comments in the chat as you were talking and showing the pictures of just how breathtaking those illustrations are. Can you tell us a little bit more about illustrator Kristen Adam? Is she a birder? How does she get all this stuff right?
As far as I know, she's not a birder, but like I said, she did a remarkable job of walking that line of, making the visuals kid accessible and somewhat sort of like animated, for lack of a better term, without turning them into sort of like Disney sidekicks. And while keeping, the field marks that let you tell one owl from another. I don't know if, I guess I am still sharing my screen. So if you look at the picture you're looking at now, there's a great horned, a saw-whet, a barred owl, a Eurasian eagle owl, and a snowy owl. And you can tell them all apart. And that's great. That's a remarkable job that she's done. So this is as much her book as mine. She really brought the story and the enchantment of the story to life, because I think there's a lot of enchantment in talking about owls. There can't help but be enchantment when you're talking about owls, because again, they're just ambassadors from a world we just rarely get to see, and then suddenly, oh wow, owls are real. Yeah, they're real, and they're among us.
The way she captured not just the way they look, but their behaviors too, was just really incredible.
Absolutely. There was one, I'm not even going to try to go backwards because I'll just mess everything up. But there was in that picture with Flaco with that highlighted his owls. When I got the art back for that page, I'm like, oh, that's beautiful. Because I looked at it, and in the corner, there was a picture of a bug. And without realizing it, the bug she'd picked was a spotted lanternfly. And I'm like, no, change that bug. We had a good laugh about that. And of course, I recognize it right away because I am killing them without mercy in my garden when I'm in New York. I'm like, oh, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead. So I flinched as soon as I saw that picture of a spotted lanternfly. I'm like, no.
Let's hope owls and other birds develop an appetite for spotted lanternfly soon.
I have been told that the catbirds during breeding season in the Ramble were making meals of spotted lanternflies. So go catbirds.
That's great. It looks like we have a whole bunch of questions from our audience in the Q&A. So I think we can turn to that now. And I'll read the questions out loud to you, Chris. But actually,
Right?
Chris, why don't you take your screen down? There we go, so everyone can see you. Here's our first question. How can we as urban dwellers encourage safe habitat for owls?
Safe habitat. Step number one, rodenticide and getting rid of it. Raptors actually do extremely well in New York City. We have mice galore, we have rats galore, we have pigeons galore. I have at one point been on my rooftop in the middle of the East Village. So, it's not exactly a lush green area. And yet I was sitting there and there was a red-tailed hawk perched 2 roofs over, who was being tag teamed by a pair of kestrels. And I'm sitting there watching that. And then all of a sudden the kestrels stop and they hold off on the sideline because a peregrine falcon comes in and starts going after the red tail. And the poor red tail is like, oh, 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 as this peregrine falcon is strafing it. And the 2 kestrels are sitting on the sideline going, oh no, we're not getting involved in this now. And I wanted popcorn because there's this amazing aerial battle of raptors in my neighborhood. And nobody knows it but me on my rooftop. So raptors can do really, really well here in New York City, but the poison will mess them up every time. And I said mess them up instead of the word I wanted to say. So if you're going to make for a safe habitat for our raptors, owls, the hawks, the falcons, the first thing to do is get rid of the rodenticide, the poisons. The rodenticide is not going to affect the peregrines because they're not eating rodents, but boy, you get poisons into those pigeons and it'll affect the peregrines. So yeah, that's rule number one.
A follow-up question that somebody asked was about ethical owling, which is a term we use because of the disturbance that humans can present to owls. What advice do you have for ethical owling so that humans don't cause owls any harm or stress but lets us still enjoy them?
Sure. Rule number one is we don't talk about where owls are. And the reason is that in a city with this many people who understandably would be kind of thrilled to see an owl, if word got out too quickly, too far, there would be so many people that owl would rapidly leave because they'd be disturbed when they're trying to rest. And that's rule number two, which is that you never, ever get so close that you disturb the owl's rest. They need their sleep. That's what they're doing during the day when we're up and about. You don't, and since they tend to roost like Barry did in one particular spot, you don't want to make that spot untenable for them so that they leave and go someplace else. So that's rule number two. One of the most appalling things I hear about routinely, it makes me very angry. I'm so glad I'm not there because I don't know what I would do. I don't trust myself about what I do, is on the beaches of Long Island when the snowy owls show up. And there are photographers out there. There are photographers who are very ethical and, make sure not to disturb the bird. And then there are the ones who go running over the dunes, trying to get that perfect snowy owl shot and chasing the bird to and fro, here and there, everywhere. It's not right, it's unethical, and you shouldn't do it. And if you see somebody doing it, find ways to interfere. Call the authorities. If it were me, and I'm a big guy, so I could probably get away with it, but I would physically interpose myself between the camera and the owl. It's like, you're going to get really great shots of me, and that's all you're going to get. There is definitely ethical behavior towards owls that we need to promote, and hopefully, people are getting that message.
Thanks for sharing that really important message. Another owl question. Why did you choose to write about owls in particular? Are those your favorite bird, or what is your favorite bird?
Oh, God. What is my favorite bird? And I can hear a chorus in the chat going, Blackburnian warbler, which is true. No, they're not my favorite class of bird, but I don't know that I do have a favorite class of bird. I mean, hummingbirds thrill me, obviously. I was just talking about hummingbirds. And who isn't thrilled by hummingbirds? But owls are thrilling in a different way. I hate to be a broken record, but that sort of ambassador from another world thing. I feel it every time I see an owl. I'm just like, you're giving me this glimpse of almost another planet, really, because your world is so different from mine. And yet here you are. And, with those big eyes looking back at you and the head swiveling around, it's transporting. So are they my favorite class of birds? I don't know that I have a favorite class of birds. But owls are certainly a very distinctive group. And they are a group that many kids know, even if they know nothing else about birds, they know there are owls. So I think it's a great way to sort of pull kids into our birding world.
Let's move off the topic of owls specifically and talk a bit about birding and nature in general. We have a question here about New York City's biodiversity, which is immense. Chris, and many of our audience know that 350 species of birds come through New York City every year. It's one of the best spots in the country for birding. We know that here on the Zoom, but most New Yorkers don't. Chris, do you have thoughts on how we can increase New Yorkers' awareness and enjoyment of the city's biodiversity, as well as the city's reputation as a great place to experience nature?
I think that's up to us birders, actually. I think just as owls are ambassadors from another world, we all have to be ambassadors of birds and birding in general. So that, if someone shows the slightest bit of interest, when you're out there and they're like, what are you looking at? Tell them what you're looking at. Maybe even let them see it for themselves and you may change their world. I know I don't really do it anymore because we all have, sort of field guides on our phones and things. But for many years, I carried a physical field guide, a Peterson's with me or a Sibley. And if someone showed the slightest interest, I was like, a Jehovah's Witness handing out Bibles or something. I was like, oh, you like that bird? Here, take this, keep this. No, it's a gift. And, I would give away a bird book, hoping to interest them in our birds. So we can make people aware of New York's biodiversity by talking about it, by showing it to them. And of course, New York City Bird Alliance does that all the time. That's kind of what we're about. So yeah, it's up to us.
You and I riffed earlier, Chris, about the need to welcome everybody into birding and into conservation. Can you suggest some ways that as birders, we all can make birding more inclusive and welcoming?
The thing I always do, for example, if I'm in, my favorite stomping ground of Central Park, and I see somebody I don't recognize, yeah, because we all kind of know each other after a while. But if I see someone I don't recognize, I'll talk to them. I'll go over and say, "Oh, hi, I haven't seen you here before." A lot of times they're pandemic birders, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, we love you, pandemic birders," because we do, because it's been such an infusion of energy into our ranks. But yeah, talk to people, make them feel welcome, help them out with finding the birds, learning about the birds. That again, that's part of our ambassadorial duty. And if we do that, it's funny how looking at a bird can make the barriers that normally separate people fall away, from class to race to ethnicity to religion, whatever ism you want to put up there, they just kind of fall when you're looking at an amazing bird. And I always love the example that at one point in Central Park, in our Central Park birding community, we had one of the wealthiest people on the planet. I didn't even realize how wealthy he was. And we had a homeless woman who saw people in the park looking at birds, and she got interested, and somebody gave her their old pair of binoculars, and she's a birder like the rest of us. So it's like, I always say, nobody gives a damn who, what, where, how. As long as you're interested in the birds and you're willing to learn, you are welcome in our ranks.
Wonderful. We have a question from an aspiring writer in the audience who asks, how would you recommend getting started writing books for children?
Oh, wow. You don't ask the hard ones, do you? It's hard. I mean, the reason why I got the chance to write this book is because of, what happened to me, made me a little bit famous for a little while. And that, gave me the opportunity to do a whole bunch of different things, from the TV show to now this latest book. But it's really hard to get, our media landscape is so cluttered. There are so many things that are demanding people's eyeballs, that it's hard to break in without some sort of, special something to get you attention. Um, that said, that doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you're going to have to work really hard at it. It also helps if you're a great artist, because where it's difficult to judge someone's writing at a glance, it's not hard to judge art at a glance. And so if you are an artist, or you can pair yourself up with a good artist, then I think that increases your chances of getting your children's book out there.
Well, I think anybody would be lucky to have a terrific illustrator like Kristen. So if she's looking for her next project, it sounds like we might have some ideas in the audience.
I hope she wins lots of awards for her art. I know we're going to submit her for it. So I hope she
Well
walks away
deserved.
with plenty of bling.
We have a question that goes back to threats facing wild birds, and it's a human caused threat. It's about overfeeding ducks and waterfowl. Our audience member asks, a local park has issues with overfeeding ducks and other birds. They're part of a group planning an education and outreach event. How can we discourage feeding bread to community members in a palatable way?
Oy, another asking the hard questions. Um, it's funny, I approach this not so much with ducks because of where I live, but with pigeons, with the people who feed pigeons. And, they think they're doing a good thing. And really what they're ultimately doing is exacerbating the rat problem in the East Village. So how do you communicate that when this is bringing them enjoyment and is bringing them proximity to wildlife, which we want? We want people to have proximity to our wild creatures and appreciate them. I don't have a good answer, is the bottom line. Education helps, but how do you do that? If you just see somebody, throwing bread to ducks in the water, you're going to just kind of randomly walk up to them and say, oh, yeah, I hope you're enjoying that. But you probably shouldn't do that. And, it's difficult. It's difficult. I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry.
It's the same thing with the ethical owling question. You can put yourself between a camera and an owl, but the person might not really get it. The photographer might not understand what the issue is unless you can figure.
I think it's a little different because with the feeding of the ducks, it seems harmless. The unethical photographers, they know they're causing harm. They just don't care. So yeah, that's a little bit of a difference there. Hopefully, some education campaigns will get people to realize, oh yeah, maybe feeding these ducks is not the best of all possible things. But
Well, it looks like we have time for just one last question, and we have one about getting off of Zoom. We have a reader or an audience member who loves this book and wants to share it with their family members and asks if you'll be holding any readings in public or book signings this year.
wow, I don't know. They don't do book tours, and certainly not for kids' books the way they used to. So I, may end up doing a signing while I'm out here in Palm Springs, California. We'll see. But so far the plans are very nebulous. But I would be happy to do, signings. I'm always happy to do signings. If someone's interested enough in my work to like buy a copy of my book, yeah, I can be bothered to sign it for you for sure. So, but as far as any sort of planned events right now, I don't know of anything at the moment, but that may change. And if I do, you can always check my Instagram. That's how I sort of keep in touch publicly is through Instagram, and my handle is Christian Cooper Birder, all strung together. And so that's a good way to find out if there is going to be some sort of upcoming signing.
That's great. We'll drop that link into the chat right now so folks can follow you on Instagram. We're also going to drop a link into the chat for folks to buy your book, which you said comes out in just a few weeks. So please give it a look. And Chris, can you tell us what's next for you? What other exciting projects do you have on the horizon?
Oh my God, I wish I knew. I'm sort of making it up as I go along now, because sadly, the show is done. They told us a while ago that the show would not be coming back, Extraordinary Birder, the TV show for Nat Geo, which I loved doing and was so much fun. But they said, yeah, no, we're taking our channel in a different direction. And then we won an Emmy. So I was like, but I really don't know. I'm trying to figure that out. And if my partner is watching, he's like, yeah, he's been trying to figure it out for a while. You better figure it out soon. So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Well, I know that we all can't wait to see what's next. In the meantime, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us tonight, and to all of our audience members who tuned in. We hope you'll join us for another New York City Bird Alliance event soon. We run bird outings all year round in all weather, so get outside to enjoy owls this winter and the other magical birds that call New York City home. You can see a full calendar of events on our website, which is the link for which is being dropped into the chat right now. And if you're looking forward to more Flaco content, you can join New York City Bird Alliance next Wednesday, February 12th at the New York Historical for a special panel discussion and a new exhibit about Flaco's year in the wild. We'll be there to talk about how his legacy can create a safer city for wild birds. Thank you again, and thank you to Chris. I hope to see you all birding or owling again soon. Have a great night, everybody. Bye.